Hi folks, the following presentation is meant to complement a video I did about 3 years ago on soldering tip care and maintenance. In this presentation I'm going to talk about soldering flux in the context of hand soldering. I'm going to go into detail about what flux is, the definition of it, the different types of flux, some of the different applications, and also the characteristics of the flux. Depending on your level of interest, you may want to pause the video as needed to read the slides and the information that's contained on the slides. I hope that you find this useful and informative. Thank you. The first thing I'd like to talk about is operator safety. Flux fumes are hazardous, so we need to prevent these fumes from entering our lungs. So we can either work in a well-ventilated area, or use some type of fume extraction system, or wear an appropriate particle mask or respirator. So the metals that we typically use in the soldering process oxidize or tarnish when they're exposed to air. So in order to establish a proper intermetallic bond, these oxides must be chemically removed from the metals to be soldered. So the only means of reducing or removing these oxides so that clean base metals can become completely exposed is with a material called flux. So for the purposes of hand soldering, it is impossible to solder without the use of some type of flux. Now flux is only meant to remove oxides from the materials being soldered. It's not designed or meant to remove oils or any other particulates from the materials being soldered. Now flux is available in many forms such as liquid, paste, solid, and also flux pens which look like a magic marker. So for hand soldering, alcohol-based fluxes or paste fluxes are recommended, as water-based fluxes are reserved for wave soldering since they spatter badly when touched with a hot soldering iron tip. Now aside from the different forms that flux comes in, there are also different categories of fluxes. So traditionally, there are rosin fluxes, there are organic acid fluxes, and there are inorganic fluxes, which we'll talk about shortly. Now the fluxes in this image are just 3 different fluxes. The one on the left is an organic acid no-clean. The one in the middle is a rosin flux in a little nail polish bottle. And the one on the right is a very active inorganic acid flux. Now this is an image of a paste flux. It's a rosin paste flux and it's considered a no-clean. So the residues from this can be left on the circuit board or on whatever assembly you're soldering. And here is an image of a no-clean flux pen. This is an organic acid that can also be left on the board. This is a very low solids flux. It doesn't have extremely high activity, but this is meant to leave on a circuit board or leave on the assembly that you're soldering. Now within the 3 general categories of fluxes, there are different activity levels. The activity level indicates to us the ability of the flux to remove the oxides from the metals. We use the term solderability to describe how readily the base metals accept solder. So the activity of the flux must be matched with the composition and condition of the materials being joined. So, for example, stainless steel or aluminum have poor solderability and would be very difficult to solder and would require a more active flux, while copper, tin, or silver, for example, would be very easy to solder with a lower activity flux. Also, if the base metals are highly oxidized, a more active flux or some additional preliminary cleaning would be necessary. If the flux is not active enough to remove the oxides, increasing the time or temperature on the connection will not improve the situation. It'll only make it worse, as most of the flux will be burned away with the extra time or increased temperature. In general, the higher the activity level of the flux, the more corrosive the flux becomes, and the more necessary it may be to remove the flux residues after soldering. A word of caution here. The inorganic acid fluxes like zinc chloride, stannous chloride, ammonium phosphate, hydrochloric acid, hydrobromic acid are all extremely corrosive and should never be used on electrical assemblies, as the residues will eventually become electrically conductive. Inorganic acid fluxes are usually reserved for stained glass, plumbing, automotive radiator, or other industrial applications where you would be soldering lead, brass, nickel, or bronze, just to name a few metals. In terms of cleaning the flux residues, rosin or resin fluxes are not water soluble, and their residues need to be removed, if necessary, with alcohol or other flux solvent. Organic acids and inorganic acids can usually be removed with water and/or an appropriate solvent. There are also fluxes classified as no-clean fluxes which, in some cases, do not need to be removed after soldering. These fluxes are mostly in the rosin-resin family, and there are a few of them in the organic acid family. These fluxes can also be removed, if desired, with the appropriate flux solvent. Now would be a good time to talk about what would be an appropriate flux to use for soldering wiring. It is strongly recommended that the use of a no more active flux than an RMA, that's a mildly activated rosin, or a no-clean. The use of any higher activity fluxes, like an activated rosin, organic or inorganic flux, could cause corrosion, degradation, and shorting of the wires over time. If you're unable to tin a wire with these lower activity fluxes, the best thing to do is to replace the wire with a newer, more solderable one. This image illustrates some examples of solderability conditions that I've been talking about. This is a component that has been exposed to the environment for about 40 years. The lead labeled oxidized lead is what the lead looked like after that exposure. The wetted lead was soldered with a very active stannous chloride flux with acceptable results. The flux used on the de-wetted lead was a mildly activated rosin flux, RMA for short, and was only able to partially remove the oxides from the surface, hence the term de-wetting. With the bottom non-wetted lead, the flux was a low activity flux and was not able to wet the lead at all. The only other way to have soldered these leads a little bit more easily would have been to abrade each lead past the tin plating down to the bare copper base metal in order to allow me to use a slightly less active flux. So again, we cannot accomplish a good intermetallic bond without the metals being able to accept solder. I hope you found this video helpful. Please feel free to contact me with any questions, comments, or criticisms. I know it's a lot of material to cover in a very short period of time, but let me know if I can help. Thank you.